Hi, this is Carl Irwin, and we're going to take another look at the Muse sounds, brass sounds, and some techniques for mocking up from the notation file. What we want to do here is look at the composition as it is, and this would be the print composition that someone would read from, and then there's parts up here that have been organized for each player to all engraved. Each player can read from these. But the simplicity of the notation here that has the essential data for a musician is not really all of the data for a musical performance. Whenever a performer plays a piece of music, they add a whole other category of music, and that is musicianship. That is the interpretive choices that every individual musician makes, however subtle or overt. These are the decisions that make a musical performance what it really is. Otherwise, it's merely just a mechanical reproduction, audio reproduction of what the score says. Whenever you play into Digital Audio Workstation using MIDI controllers and MIDI data, if you're using all of the controllers that you should be using, you will be creating a human performance. You will be adding elements of musicianship to that performance. When we're playing back from notation, while there is a play engine that in this case is working from, in the case of Muse Sounds, is working from samples, in other cases, you're working from modeling based on the analysis of instruments and samples. Either way, what it's going to do is play fairly precisely what the music says and no more. Certainly no less, but certainly no more than what the music says. Even with good AI analysis, a computer playback that would add elements of musicianship could only ever really be one, or at least a very narrow interpretation of musicianship, which is not reality. If you put a piece of music in front of one, for example, this piece in front of one orchestral brass section, and then put the same piece in front of a different orchestral brass section, it will be different. It will sound different in terms of the musicianship choices. So this is the problem in playback from notation, is that the notation itself does not actually have all of the data that is necessary. Now, that brings us to the other problem, which we've discussed on the channel before, is this a debate about how that extra data should be handled. Should there be a layer where you have essentially MIDI-controlled data that you can enter to deal with the musicianship elements of the performance? Or is it completely sufficient just to copy the notation, make another iteration of it, and change the notation, particularly with dynamics and articulation and lengths, to generate a humanized performance of it? I don't think it really matters how you do it. Either way, you're using available controls. And the fact that MuseScore currently does not have a MIDI layer with MIDI controller data that can be interpreted by the play from notation engine, because it's a play from notation engine, it doesn't actually work for MIDI. Because it doesn't have that layer, it doesn't mean you can't create mockups. And it isn't really adding any actual frustration to use the notation to call up the samples that you want or to create a humanized playback. That whatever frustration one feels is entirely artificial. It's made up. It's not a real frustration because you're not actually adding any more data than you would be if you had to use a digital audio workstation kind of environment. And that just opens up a lot of doors. That if you're willing, you take your piece of music that you've notated cleanly for performance, and you change it slightly or significantly, however deep you want to go with this, to make a playback that is an adequate representation within the means that you have with the engine that you're working with and the samples you're working with or the modeling engine you're working with to create a human playback, a humanized playback. So that's what we're going to look at. And this is something, again, I've been saying. So I think some people that are relatively new to this, they've come from digital audio workstation. I remember back in the day, 25 years ago, when digital audio workstations were kind of coming to be, and you had Pro Tools and Cakewalk. Cakewalk was kind of the home user DAW. Pro Tools was what everybody used, and still a lot of people use Pro Tools. Those were kind of the first environments. I remember people saying, well, these digital audio workstations, this is a manner for illiterate musicians who have poor literacy in music in terms of musical notation. That's a way for them to create music. And a lot of musicians, classically trained musicians and composers, looked down on the use of digital audio workstation. And it's just so funny to me that it's gone entirely the other way, where you have reputable composers actually dogging on people that would bother to write in notation as an exclusive entry, and then trying to mock up from that. But I remember back in the day that when we looked at those digital audio workstations, and that was kind of in its infancy, most classically trained composers weren't using them. They were creating playback files. And this is an old technique. It's just made so much better because the engines and the sample sets and the modeling engines are so much better now. You just can get a whole lot more out of using this technique now than you could 25 years ago. But anyway, that's just a quick history of this technique. It's an old one. It's not new. It's not hacking. I mean, it's somewhat hacky, but it's not really something that has come about because of a missing feature, really, in Muse Score. And quite to the contrary, it's an old technique that, when applied in Muse Score 4, makes good use of the newest features, which is the play engine, and that modeling that's going on in the engine using the sample sets that we have. So let's look at this here. This is the original piece. It's the Lord's Prayer by Albert H. Malotte, and you may be familiar with this piece. I actually have heard this piece many, many, many times. I've never been a real big fan of it. I don't know why. As far as kind of sacred service music goes, there's other pieces contextually that I've liked more than this one. Maybe it has to do with the way that you often will hear this performed. But I was reminded of it recently because my family took a trip down to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where they have Sight and Sound Theater, and they do biblical theater productions. And I remembered one production previously, and it's probably the best musical moment I've ever heard in their productions, was an iteration, an interpretation of the Lord's Prayer by Albert H. Malotte. And it was beautifully done, very moving. And it just kind of jogged my memory. So I kind of went back to this, and I decided I'd take a crack at it with some orchestral brass. And I would create this as a means to demonstrate some of these techniques for mocking up. So let's take a look at the original and listen to it very quickly. This is the piece as it is notated to be read. And this is on musescore.com. I don't really post much of anything on musescore.com, but I did post this one. If anybody wants it, I'll put the link in the description if someone would be interested in it at all to play it. But let's take a listen here and see what kind of performance we get from the notation, the pure notation file. Okay, so this is what we have, and let's go through some of the problems very quickly here with the playback. First of all, we just have to appreciate how far this technology has come, because even with the issues that we have to contend with, the sounds are really, really great. The samples are great. The balance of the samples is pretty good. They sound like they're in the same environment. This sounds like a group. Now and I also have to say this too. I've seen a lot of comparisons, and I don't really want to be on this bandwagon and make these comparisons, but I will do it just to explain, at least as far as Muse Score 4, what is so good about it. I've seen a lot of comparisons between Muse Score 4's Play Engine and Note Performer online, a lot of different examples. And I often see replies, I think mostly because of the faithfulness to, the biased faithfulness to Note Performer, that a lot of people will say, well, the Note Performer sounds so much better, so much cleaner than Muse Score. Muse Score sounds kind of muddy. You can't hear the articulations very clearly. And I hear what they're saying, but my complaint has always been, yeah, but that's not real. That's not realistic at all, is particularly with the brass stuff. Certainly you can hear all the articulations with the Note Performer iteration of it and the modeling engine that they have. The problem is that that's not what it actually sounds like in a real place. So the number one issue I think is key is that when you're mocking up, and frankly, when you're writing music, just when you're writing music, you need to know what ensembles sound like. You need to have experience being with ensembles, maybe being in ensembles, being around them, hearing them live, not merely just hearing recordings of them, which are in themselves are an artificial representation, but actually knowing what instruments sound like in the context in which you are composing. That is crucial. It's essential. And I see a lot of these comments, and my gut instinct is telling me this is coming from people who don't really know what this sounds like, what these instruments really sound like in a real situation. And I think Muse Score does this very well. This sounds like a group from note one in a real place. And the things that you lose inside of the sound is realistic to what you lose inside of a real performance. The best example of this is when you have an orchestra performing a piece, a symphony orchestra, and there's something very loud happening. You'll hear the brass section just shut everything else out. And if you look at the notation, you might see that there's a violin run, a violin section run, or a woodwind run that's going on, but you actually can't hear it. You don't really hear it for what it looks like on the page at all. It's drowned out by some big, brass block chord movement. That's realistic. And if you have an engine which makes all of those things audible and articulate and clean and clear and crisp, that's not actually real. You're actually working against realism when that kind of thing happens. So this is a little bit of perspective, I think, on what we want to accomplish with these engines and with our mock-ups, is we're really going for realism. So now, I also have to say that even though you wouldn't hear those runs specifically in those moments, if you took the runs out, it would be missed. So there is an added effect. There is a composite effect of having that material there that in and of itself is not appreciated and would be very difficult, if not really impossible, to transcribe just from listening in a real environment. If you took it away, it would be missed. It would be an entirely different sound. That is the reality of the sound of instruments. So we're not going for crisp and clean and clear on every single note and articulation, because that is fake. That is not real. It's not realistic. It's not a true mock-up. Let's take a look here at some issues. So the number one problem that we have with the notation playback is that the dynamics are flat. When it says mezzo piano for an extended period of time, the instruments play exactly as it says, mezzo piano, and that is not realistic. Performers would, as the contour of the line changes, will add nuance, changes, and dynamics. And I don't mean within the confines of what a mezzopiano would be. I mean, they would actually be adding dynamic changes that could be demonstrated by another dynamic. So when their mezzopiano gets a little bit louder in their musicianship input, the way they perceive it, the way they interpret the music, they would be pushing to a mezzo forte or a forte. When they get softer in the line on their mezzo piano that's written on the page, they would be playing a piano or a pianissimo. And always keep in mind, too, that dynamics actually are a relative concept. Mezzo piano is not one thing. This is the problem with notation software and having an engine. If you create an engine that plays back and it's consistent, and it's always playing consistently on these dynamics, that's not real. Because forte is not one thing. Forte is many things depending on the context, the instrumentation, and especially the context. What kind of music is it? Where is it being played? How is the balance and blend being handled in that moment? Forte does not always mean the same thing. You could have a piece of music where the loudest dynamic is forte, and then you could have another piece of music where the loudest dynamic is fortissimo. You have 3 Fs on there. And if you compare the performer playing at both of those dynamics on those 2 different pieces in 2 different contexts, they're actually playing the same dynamic, the same volume. It's all relative. That's the reality of dynamics. So even on the notation, the dynamics are relative. There is a lot of musicianship that informs the dynamic contrast within a passage that has one dynamic marking. So that's number one. We have to add changes to the dynamics to make it more musical and more human. The second thing is breathing. You could put breath marks in there. Breath marks are a notation. It's not just a suggestion, as some people think. A breath mark actually is a piece of notation. It's something that indicates a break. You could do that. But the fact is that wind players in particular will take breaths at staggered times. And you have to individually look at every single part and determine as a human when you would breathe. Sometimes it would be on the given phrase in unison with other people playing the same rhythmic phrasing. Other times it will be at very odd places that is advantageous only to that part where other people are not taking a breath. And when, as a wind player, you take a breath, you really do shorten the note value. The note value is shortened. And there even is sometimes, in some interpretation, a slight delay on the next attack. Very minor, but it is potentially there. If we can insert some of this sensibility, we will create more realism than what the engine is doing right now. And keep in mind, too, that if you have, 2 measures in 4/4 time at 80 beats per minute of a note that's tied together, 8 beats in total, and then there's a breath, the musician takes a breath after that, you're looking at about half of a beat of loss at the end of those 8 beats. It's really 7.5 beats of sound, and then half of a beat of a breath. Up to that, maybe even up to a full beat in some situations. So the breathing for professionals, for good players, people that are extremely precise, is a pretty big amount of space that is part of that interpretation when the breath is taken. So we need to add that in there too. There is also some issues, in addition to the dynamics, with articulation. Performers add nuanced articulation as they play a line. You could have a line that has no articulation markings on it. There's no legato slurring. There's no staccato, no marcato, no tenuto marks, nothing else. It's just plain notation. And with each note that they play, there will be a nuanced articulation to it. And that's informed also by the interpretation of the line in the context of the rhythms. Now, the engine actually does a decent job at having some variation there on these playback engines, But the variation is so minor, and it's also very consistent. If you have two instances of the exact same line played back to back, you will hear that it is the exact same performance. That's not realistic. That's not what a person would do. So what we can do is go in and add articulations in there based on the line, based on a musical interpretation of each sequence of notes individual to the part, and add articulations that would emulate what a player might do in a situation. And by the way, there's no right and wrong to some of these choices. You can actually make very vastly different choices. You will get a very vastly different outcome, just as if you put the piece of music in front of two different ensembles and you would hear nuanced differences between those performances, even though they're professionals. So articulation, we're going to look at that as well. Another problem with this piece, I did this on purpose, is I put some ornamentation in there. It doesn't really interpret the ornamentation necessarily the way that a player would. It does its best to give a very generic interpretation of ornamentation, but ornamentation is a highly subjective thing. There are common practice interpretations to ornamentation. There are Baroque interpretations to ornamentation. There's contemporary iterations of that. So with all these different interpretations of ornamentation, in an actual performance setting, a decision would be made about how to interpret it. So when we're doing the mock-up, we're directing an ensemble. We are deciding how we want the ornamentation to be interpreted. So you don't have to accept the playback engine's version of it. You can indicate by changing the notation exactly how you want it performed. So we're going to take care of some of that too. Yeah, there's a lot up for debate, in terms of notation and the way things are interpreted. You can put, two musicians together in a room and they will disagree on the vast majority of elements related to some of these interpretive ideas. And that's pretty normal. That's a pretty normal thing. Lastly, we also want to take care of some of the balance and blend issues using the mixer, put things into a proper place in space, mix the instruments together properly so that they sound the way we want them to as an ensemble. This is a bit of a hotly contested issue as well. There is some sentiment about these playback engines and the damage that they can do to composers who don't know what their music should sound like. And the idea that it could give a composer the false sense of what their music should sound like because the engine is misinterpreting a real situation. Again, I go back to the very beginning of this discussion here, in that it is the composer's responsibility to know what things sound like. That has always been the case. When we had notation software that would play back very artificial sounds, the artificial sounds were there not to really tell you what it sounds like, but just to give you a quick reference as a composer would get sitting at a piano and writing pencil to paper. When they play on the piano, they don't hear what horns sound like, and they don't hear that balance. It's on the composer to have that information, to have that skill set and that understanding of balance and blend as they are writing, to know what it will sound like with a group. MuseScore, in spite of its great playback engine and all these other notation softwares that use Note Performer, they are on the same footing. They don't necessarily dictate what things will sound like in reality. They're just merely giving us a better idea in real time what things would sound like rather than plunking on a piano and using our imagination. There's less imagination involved. They could not possibly actually get the balance and blend right in a notation program because, again, everything is subject to interpretation. When you put music in front of one ensemble in one place and you put the same music in front of another ensemble, you will get different interpretations. Different rooms give different sounds, different directors give different direction, and so forth. So what we have here is a situation where we have to be the director and we're going to dictate what the balance and blend should be. It's up to the user to use the mixer. Using the mixer is not a hack. Using the mixer is a feature. You should use it. You should set the balance and blend the way you want it to sound and the way you anticipate it would sound in a real environment so that you can hear that played back the way you intend it to be performed by people. So we're going to deal with that as well. Those are the big issues. The one last issue I want to deal with here is also a hotly contested issue. That is the fact that some of the samples and some of the well, let's just put it this way. There's bugs. There's bugs in there, right? Some instruments play funny things. They do strange things. They make clicks and pops on certain notes. Some notes play louder than others. Some notes might not be exactly in tune the way you would expect it to be. I don't really find that a lot. I've heard a lot of people complain about that sort of thing. Intonation, I find, is to be pretty impeccable. If you ever find a note that doesn't sound right, it's probably because it's picking on the wrong sample, and you'd want to file a bug report on that one. But I mostly find issues with clicks and pops. A sample on some instrument that might not be closing out properly and you get a click or a pop, or something that starts too abruptly and you're not getting the articulation on it. So there's some of those things that are going to be ever-changing with your music, with your notation platform and the play engine. Once they fix one thing, something else will pop up whenever they update the sounds. It's a never-ending cycle. You just have to keep filing bug reports so that whatever you're dealing with gets fixed. But in the meantime, as you're creating music, don't wait for it to be fixed to create your next piece of music. Deal with it, right? You can go in there and change the notations in such a way that you can kind of mitigate some of these errors that are inherent to a very complex system like this. So we're going to deal with some of that too. Specifically, as we were listening to this, you'll notice that the tuba part, as of this date right now in time, in June of 2025, the tuba has a lot of clicks and pops on releases. It's kind of been going on this way for a few months now, and we're waiting on a fix. But I'm going to make music. I'm not going to not make music because the tuba doesn't play right. What I can do is I can go in and fix that. So we're going to look at that a little bit too. Anyway, these are the issues to deal with. This is the original notation. Let's look at the playback file. So here is the playback file, and it has all of the same notation that we had before. However, there is a lot more going on here. There's a lot more dynamic contrast being written in. If you remember, this whole opening right here is in mezzo piano to a decrescendo on the last measure. But here I've got instruments swelling on part 1 and 2 in the horns. And then it's just staying normal down in part 3 and 4 to give some inflection, humanized inflection. Down here in the trumpets, this entrance is supposed to be, I believe it was piano. Let's go back and take a look here. Trumpet entrance is piano. And here I have it coming in at pianissimo. Also notice that I've got pianissimo sitting out here 1 measure ahead. One problem with the play from notation engine here in Muse score, is sometimes it doesn't necessarily read a dynamic immediately when it is presented. Sometimes there'll be a little bit of a pop, a little bit of a hiccup right at the beginning where it clicks into the proper dynamic. So whenever that happens, the quick fix to that is to put the dynamic change on the previous rest. This only ever happens coming off of rests. You won't really notice it coming from note to note if you have a terraced dynamic that's changing suddenly. It's not really noticeable in that situation with the reverb. But when you have a rest, and then you have an entrance, it can be noticed. So this is what you do. You put the dynamic you want to go to here. And I found that the piano entrance was a little bit too heavy. So I put a pianissimo entrance for a half note going to another half note of piano. This would be a whole note, so I changed the notation to make that work. Over here we have ornamentation. I removed the ornamentation and I literally wrote it out using proper rhythms. For the tuba problems, you can see that on the tuba, what I do is I split up, like here this was a whole note. I split up to a half note and a half note. On the second half note, I put a decrescendo down to the lowest pianissimo to get to a place where we cannot hear the pop and click that happens with that sample. So you'll see this happen a lot on the endings of tuba phrases to make it release without that discrepancy, without that artifact that we don't want. You can see over here some other things going on. Again, drastic changes in dynamics. Here the dynamic was only sitting at 1 dynamic through this whole portion, but I have each individual part changing pretty significantly. I shorten up note lengths and change dynamics note for note to get to eliminate the sense of what we call machine gunning. That is when you have a repeated note on the same articulation and the same dynamic, and it sounds like it's the exact same sample being played. There's more issues to that. Even if you have round robin sampling, it still can sound kind of machine gunny because a real person does not interpret the exact same note being played twice in sequence the exact same way. There will be dynamic differences and even articulation differences. So what I did is I actually changed the dynamic between these two notes. There's a terraced dynamic change. I shortened up a note before to add breathing. Look at the breathing stuff in here. There's a lot of places where there's rests right in the middle of a phrase or at the end of a note where I cut notes short and I tie to an eighth note, put an eighth rest in there, because I'm really dictating where individuals would be breathing. I literally go through part by part and I play back the part individually and I decide, okay, if I'm playing this, this is where I would take a breath. This is the articulation I would put on here. Down here we have some repeated trumpet, fanfare kind of elements here, and see how I mixed up the articulations, and they're inconsistent between the parts, and they're inconsistent in repetition from measure to measure. That doesn't do the same thing twice, the player, even though they're playing the same rhythm. That adds considerable realism to the musical performance. A lot more hairpin dynamics in here that are a little bit more nuanced than what is in the actual piece. There's not very many hairpin dynamics in the actual notation, but I put them in there because instruments will create a swelling effect as more instrumentation comes in. There's a little bit more competition and a psychological, even with professionals, a psychological outcome that they will give a little bit more support in blending and balancing and adjusting to the addition of other instruments. So I actually added that. And notice it's not for every instrument. Some instruments don't do that. Here I've got a bass trombone crescendoing the trombone 2, trombone 1. But trombone 3 doesn't do that until the pickup note to the next phrase. And that is very, very realistic. That's what people would do. Again, adding rests here where breathing would happen, shortening up notes rather than having a half note and a dotted half note. I put a dotted quarter note and then a breath for that player to be able to play this longer note value later on. And not everybody's breathing in the same places. This is very important. Forte piano. There's a big forte piano that happens here, and I did not use the actual forte piano because the forte piano in Muse score is too consistent in its interpretation. That's not realistic. So I added a forte decrescendo on tighter, smaller notational values that are tied together, and I changed the low end. So here we have a mezzo piano here on the 8th note on beat 1. Here there is a mezzo piano on the end of beat 2. Down here we have a mezzo piano on beat 2. Down here it's just a mezzo forte on the end of beat 1. So we have different kind of arrival points that sound considerably more realistic the way nuanced interpretation would be among players. In professional players we're talking about. You'll see that this does not sound like, as Anne Catherine Dern likes to say, a high school band when you're changing elements like this. What we're actually emulating is what you would be doing naturally in Digital Audio Workstation with your controller data. You would be working the mod wheel and the fader on the expression in such a way that you get nuanced differences between the instruments in terms of timing and value. And we're just doing it here using dynamics. So we're not going overboard and making this sound bad in order to sound good. We're making it sound real in order to sound good, which is a very different concept. So keep that in mind. We're not talking about monkeying around with things to make error. We're not making error. We're making perfection. This is actual perfection. Human playback, human interpretation is perfect. It's a perfection because it is human, and we're trying to add that humanity to it. So just a philosophical difference I have there. Anyway, these are, that's pretty much it. Let's listen to this. But before we do, let's look at the mixer real quick. You can see what I did is I gave some instruments a little bit more weight than others because this is typical to what players would do in those roles. Lead instruments get a little bit more volume than some of the others. They're going to be playing a little bit bigger. Very low bass instruments, sometimes I bump those up too, because there's a foundational expectation from the lowest parts and sections to give some support there. So I have bass trombone up here pretty high. Trombone's bumped a little bit compared to some of the other instrumentation down here. Horns I kind of pulled back because the horns are pretty aggressive in the playback engine. Trumpets I bumped up because that's realistic. Trumpets are really kind of mow everything over at the loudest volumes, particularly the principal lead trumpet. And the first trombone I bumped up here. These 3 trombone parts, but particularly part 1 is a little bit higher than the others. And then I also put them in panned locations, and I set the reverb essentially in the same ballpark. I gave a little bit more reverb to the trumpets. I just found that it makes them sound a little bit cleaner in terms of articulation, to have a little bit more kind of goo sticking to them from the reverberation. And then on the timpani, I pulled it down quite a bit, and on the percussion also, I pulled it back a little bit just to give a little bit more clarity in those instruments, which is a little bit more realistic. The one problem you get with percussion in an electronic environment is as you add reverb to it, it sounds less real. It sounds completely buried. And you always maintain the definition of percussion instruments because you always hear the dry sound immediately first. It's not like a wind instrument where there's a staggered kind of a tapered attack to it, and certainly not with strings. With percussion instruments, there's an immediate response. We want to be able to hear it. So I have the reverb down a little bit so that we keep that definition. We don't artificially remove it. Anyway, those are just some thoughts on the mixer as well. And again, doing this is not a laborious problem. Doing this is a feature. It's a powerful feature in any playback engine, the ability to mix as you see fit. And doing this right does not depend on the Muse sounds people and the playback engine people that Muse score. It doesn't depend on them having the right interpretation. It depends on the user, the composer, knowing what ensembles are supposed to sound like. That's your job. That's your responsibility. You need to investigate that, and then you need to make decisions that will, here, using the tools that they give you to make it right. Let's listen to this from beginning to end now with all these adjustments. Notice, I'll just point out too, I didn't go light on the changes. I was very picky. I went through, and if I hear something I didn't like, I made a change. That's how you have to look at it. You have to pick away until you either get sick of picking away and you just have to be done with it, or until you're satisfied. As satisfied as you can be with the tools that you have. Okay? All right, let's listen. So there we have a mock-up for either demo purposes or for release, something that, could be released as a representation of the music. And, without the access to an actual orchestral section to play it, which frankly none of us have. Most people using these platforms will never actually have their music played by an actual group, and that's the benefit to having these engines, is the ability to actually render out our music in a final release, so it can be shared and listened to not as a demonstration but as music. And it's only going to get better. I mean, we're only going to improve over time with the controls that we have, the ability that we have to create mock-ups, particularly with the advent of AI engines and whatnot. So anyway, those are my thoughts on all of this. Again, a little bit deeper look into some issues that maybe you haven't thought about or haven't considered, or maybe have run up against and not had an answer for. I wish you the best of luck with this, and happy composing and happy mixing.